So last week, I watched I Saw the TV Glow, and I was touched by it, and I analyzed it, spoiler-free. But this time, I want to get into a full spoiler-filled discussion, breaking down the entire thing from the very beginning all the way to the very end, including the symbolism of the pink opaque, Mr. Melancholy and his demons, the ghost tattoos, the burning TV, Maddie's disappearance, Maddie's constellation monologue, the final episode of the pink opaque, and the ending of the movie. And as I've done before, I'll be featuring some of your comments from my previous video along the way in this video. So let's get started. So as I usually do, before we get into the whole story from start to finish, I have to establish the overall message and thematic purpose of the movie. And I think at this point, the best thing I can do is pull the quote directly from the writer-director, Jane Schoenbrun, on the topic of their sexuality and gender identity. It's a film that I wrote in the early stages of transition as I was dealing with the fallout from coming out. And this idea of holding myself in my entire life until this breaking point. And this really is the arc of the film. And if you saw my previous video, you've heard this quote before, but what I want to really make sure that I highlight is Jane saying that they held themselves in until a breaking point. This overall is exactly what is happening to our two main characters, so let's get into it from the very start. The film opens with a black screen as we listen to this old school 90s TV audio, hearing the viewer actually flip from channel to channel. And as soon as this TV audio cuts out, we see this suburban neighborhood road with glowing chalk drawings all over it. And at the end of the street, a glowing ice cream truck as we listen to this slow, eerie ice cream truck music, as if it's playing in the middle of the night. And the reason why, at the very start of this film, we're hearing this audio and seeing these visuals is for the film to immediately set the tone for how it wants to communicate its message stylistically. I'm more interested as an artist in memory, in dreams, and in tone, and in moving through cinematic space in a way that can evoke emotional experience of a dream or thinking back on how childhood felt. And in this film, I'm trying to do exactly that. It's a memory film. It's not trying for realism, it's trying for an emotional logic. So as demonstrated in that opening shot and opening audio, Jane is trying to capture the feeling of memory, nostalgia, self-reflection, and childhood, all through this distorted, dreamlike audiovisual style. And that's what I think the viewer needs to keep in mind when watching a movie like this. It makes you understand a lot more why everything is so slow, loose, and non-linear. So the first character we see, of course, is Owen as a child, the most main character of the movie. And this concept of 90s dreamlike nostalgia is carried on beautifully as we see him watching a preview to a show he isn't allowed to watch. And right after, a slow, dreamy visual of him in the classic elementary school gym class parachute. In the next scene, Owen meets Maddie as she's reading about the TV show that he wasn't allowed to watch. The pink opaque. At first, Maddie is a little cold, but as soon as Maddie discovers Owen's fascination with the show, a really close connection begins between them. And she invites him to sneak out of his house and sleep over at her place to watch an episode of the pink opaque. And when the episode starts, we watch the episode with Owen and Maddie, but it plays like we are recollecting the episode as if it was 30 years ago from now. It all plays like a memory of the episode. We see these brief visuals of the opening theme, the opening music, the opening credits fading in and fading out as we see the first scene. And then these dreamy transitions to the more creepy visuals and eerie sounds that you probably would remember if you were thinking back to when you saw it when you were a little kid. And then we hear the line, "I wish the ice cream man didn't have to leave when it got cold in the winter. I wish he would never go away." Of course, tying in with this continuous theme of holding on to the innocence of childhood and that warmth of nostalgia. However, I also have to highlight what I believe is the most important thing about this clip that we see of the pink opaque. So as I've just described, there is this through line of the warmth of childhood and never wanting to let it go. But also, while these beautifully nostalgic scenes play out, they're also always met with this feeling of eeriness and creepiness and horror. While that character says he never wants the ice cream man to go away, we see this visual of an ice cream monster terrorizing this child in their bedroom. It's this immediate irony. And also, with the chalk drawing opening shot, that ice cream truck music was playing in the middle of the night with cricket sounds behind it in this eerie, slow, distorted way. And all of this means Jane Schoenbrun is saying there's an element of the 90s that they look back upon fondly, but even in her memory, it's inseparable with this ongoing trauma and fear. I didn't realize until later that Pete and Pete were in the movie, as well as Fred Durst. I thought Fred Durst was a pretty solid choice because he represents the douchey first bros of that era. Watch Woodstock 99 for more, and he was the dad. It was incredible casting. Totally agree. Yes, even the casting contributes to this juxtaposition between fear and 90s nostalgia. And this continuous merge of nostalgia and discomfort seems to be completely purposeful, especially when you consider the upbringing that Jane had. It's not an autobiographical film, but it's quite a personal film. And for myself, growing up in the suburbs, growing up as a trans and queer person who did not understand myself, in this monocultural space, you're certainly not encouraged to express queerness. For me, it's a film about how we cope with repression. It's a film about where repression comes from and this quiet power of shame. And it's a film about how that can eventually and finally crack in a way that you can't hide from anymore. So the element of horror and tension amongst the nostalgia is an audio-visual representation of the repression that Owen and Maddie are going through. As Owen grows up in this film, as well as Maddie, it is made clear to us that the two of them are part of the queer community, but are struggling to understand themselves in a time and place where gender identity and sexuality is either one thing or the other, and everything else is simply not belonging or wrong. You can very clearly see how this crushing force of shame and misunderstanding from their abusive parents, so-called friends, and community has cursed them with this wildly severe anxiety. The reason why the Pink Opaque is so important to them is because it's where they get at least the slightest feeling of representation and ability to identify with someone else. At one of their sleepovers, Maddie says, "Sometimes the Pink Opaque feels more real than real life." Every character and major detail of the Pink Opaque figuratively symbolizes the reality of Owen and Maddie's life. The spiritual connection between Tara and Isabel reflects the unique human connection that is developed between Maddie and Owen. Mr. Melancholy reflects the never-ending feeling of depression, anxiety, and shame looming over them as he terrorizes Tara and Isabel from episode to episode. And the weekly demons that Tara and Isabel have to defeat reflect the psychological demons that Owen and Maddie have to overcome together every day of their life as well. And as Maddie begins sending Owen tapes of the episodes, we learn more about how they connect and identify with the show and characters. The ghost tattoos indicate that they are truly special and unique, as Maddie writes to Owen on one of the tapes, and eventually draws one on his neck. The pink dress is Isabel's most powerful piece of clothing. It's magical. As we see Owen eventually wear that same dress in what we can very easily see is also his most courageous, enormous step into embracing his identity. And to comment on the first playing song of the soundtrack in the film, Starboard and Unkissed, it's simply reinforcing these themes of not belonging, feeling distorted, aimlessly drifting, and hopelessly longing for some sort of human connection. This movie has so much depth, and the soundtrack too. Yes, exactly, many of the other tracks in the soundtrack capture themes of longing for human connection, like Claw Machine by Sloppy Jane and Phoebe Bridgers, as well as more angry songs capturing the anxiety and crushing repression, like Psychic Wound by King Woman. So later on in the film, suddenly, all in one moment, Maddie disappears from society, Owen's mother passes away, Maddie's TV set is in flames, and the next season of The Pink Opaque is cancelled by the network. And very clearly, this is an incredibly pivotal moment for the film, because all of these significant events all happening at once visually and narratively symbolize the transition of having to let go of childhood completely and any element of comfort that that childhood provided. In the film, narratively and in their lives, our characters have now moved into what we call the cold, cruel, real world. adulthood. And of course, to strengthen the symbolism of this pivotal moment, right after we learn all of this shocking news, the film cuts to 8 years later. Owen now has a job working at a local movie theater where, as you can see, all of the balloons are deflated, the colors are washed out. He walks in on his manager, if you know what I mean, and his coworkers are humorously unkind to him. Even when he orders fast food, that fast food order scene is the complete opposite experience of ordering fast food when you were a little kid. And pretty shortly after, we begin seeing remnants of the pink opaque, but in the real world, almost as if the pink opaque is making its way into the real world. And at the same time, Maddie returns. Maddie claims the pink opaque is connected to the real world, and she has been living in the show. Owen counters her belief by claiming that it was only a show they used to watch. It's not part of the real world. But as Owen and Maddie have this conversation, we see these visuals of memories of them living in a world where the pink opaque and the real world are one. And I think all of this represents how we deal with trauma, how we deal with letting go of the past, and how we deal with loneliness. And it seems like each of these two characters are dealing with it in actually a completely different way. And I wouldn't say either of them have actually found success with either of their strategies. On one side, Maddie seems to have decided to cling to her past endlessly to the point of delusion, where she almost becomes this memory of herself. And on the other side, Owen seems to have decided to grow out of it and move on, getting a stable job, a house, and raising a family, essentially conforming. And so much of this is symbolized in that final episode of The Pink Opaque when Maddie gives Owen the tape and he finally gets to watch it. In the episode, Tara and Isabel are separated. Tara is buried alive in the world of The Pink Opaque, and Isabel is being tortured, forced to drink a poison by Mr. Melancholy that forces her to forget the past. It seems like the stories of both characters in The Pink Opaque seem to perfectly reflect their corresponding characters in the real world, Owen to Isabel and Maddie to Tara. This movie was great, but I still scratch my head with what happened to Maddie after. Okay, here's what I think. Maddie claims that she and Owen are actually Tara and Isabel, and they should be traveling back to the Pink Opaque where they belong to live happily. Correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but it seems like Maddie's eventual ending in this film is symbolic of someone like her resorting to suicide as a means of a solution to her situation that she couldn't find any other solution to. From my perspective, this is ultimately what is being signified by Maddie's intentions of leaving a world that she feels doesn't want her and traversing time and space to a new world where she feels like she belongs. And I think this is why we see those projected images of constellations and Greek mythological figures in the background as Maddie explains why she needs to go back. Spiritually, by passing away, you are traversing time and space and becoming this greater part of the universe beyond us living down here. And even Owen says he never saw her again. And then in Owen's case, of course, it's a lot more clear. He's decided to live on, but also to conform to the rigid categories of the modern world. And I noticed as time passes in this film, as Owen is the only character left, the element of nostalgia that we saw so much earlier starts to fade away more and more through the decades. A few examples are he buys that flat screen that wouldn't have the audio that we heard at the very beginning of the film. He also gets to stream The Pink Opaque, and the show looks dramatically different, much worse. And in the final scene, 20 years later, Owen is still living an unfulfilling life as someone who he isn't, and has a mental breakdown. And in this moment, everyone else completely freezes in time, signifying him having, as what we see, the very first moment where he is truly himself, not in any way cognizant of the world around him, screaming, "You need to help me." And when he flees away to the bathroom, we see him cut his chest open with a box cutter and pull his skin apart in front of the mirror. And then in the mirror, from his chest, we see TV light, TV static, and TV images coming out from him. And this imagery actually symbolically ties in with the title, The Pink Opaque. And here's what I mean. The term the pink opaque literally means the pink we cannot see through, which relates to the pink inside of the body, which represents the inside of oneself that we outside of them cannot see. So the title, The Pink Opaque, symbolizes the true self that isn't presented to the public. The true self that these two main characters are trying to discover. The TV broadcast is able to reflect that person inside who Maddie and Owen truly are. So symbolically, we see TV images, light, and static in them and coming out of them the same way the biological insides of the body would. This moment in the washroom, as far as we know, may be the very first time Owen has had the courage or the capacity to look within himself and find that true person he's always been afraid to reveal. I think the ending is vague enough to be sad or happy. We don't know if Owen is going to act on what he sees inside himself. He has to pretend to be accepting of the status quo because we know the trap he is in can prevent him from escaping. He did attempt to escape after watching the final episode. Also, as long as he's alive, there is still time to escape. So I can see that what's implied in your comment is that Maddie actually had a much more happy ending than I theorized, but it seems that we're kind of on the same page with Owen, and regardless, I think what you said has been beautifully put. Although Owen apologizes to the party guests on his way back from the washroom, it may have been that moment of self-reflection that could actually change his life. There is still time to discover the true human being who is glowing within. Thanks so much for watching. See you later.